The house on Crescent Drive in the Hollywood Hills had sat quiet since Penny Marshall's death in December 2018. Nestled behind tall hedges and an ivy-covered gate, the 6,000-square-foot Mediterranean-style home was discreetly listed off-market in early 2021. It wasn't a flashy celebrity estate. It had personality, history, and quirks that matched Penny's own. The listing agent described it as classic, warm, and full of charm. Nothing about the ad suggested what would follow. Mark and Layla Patterson, a couple in their early 40s, had just relocated from Chicago to Los Angeles. Mark had accepted a position in post-production at a major streaming company, while Layla, an interior designer, was thrilled to take on a renovation project with Soul. The Marshall house wasn't cheap, but it was one of the few left in the area with real character. High ceilings, vintage tile, wood-beamed archways, and a long hallway lined with built-in bookshelves. It was like stepping into an old film. Layla fell in love immediately. They moved in on a clear April afternoon. Everything was in bloom, and the city felt strangely quiet. On their first night, they unpacked in the glow of warm sconces, poured wine, and toasted to a new chapter. Penny's home would soon be theirs, in every way. The first thing Layla noticed was the smell. It wasn't constant, but it came in waves like burnt hair and vintage perfume. She assumed it was something in the ducts or old wood. She lit candles, opened windows. Still, the smell returned at odd times, always at night. Mark was less concerned. The house creaked, the plumbing groaned. "It's old," he reminded her. "Old houses have their noises." But the noises weren't random. Layla often worked late in the living room, rearranging design boards or fabrics. Around 1:30 every night, she'd hear footsteps in the hallway, soft, deliberate, padded like slippers. At first she assumed it was Mark getting up to use the bathroom. But when she looked up, no one was there. By the third week, she stopped sleeping well. She'd wake up with the sheets bunched tightly around her legs, as if something had tucked her in. And sometimes she'd hear murmuring low, indistinct voices from the hallway. A woman's tone, familiar but never clear. Once, she turned on her phone to record it, but all she captured was silence and the faint hiss of air from a closed vent. They avoided the guest room. It was the only space Layla hadn't redecorated. Something about it felt off. The air inside was colder, the curtains always drawn. One morning, while measuring the window for new drapes, Layla discovered a series of shallow claw marks along the baseboard, thin, repetitive gouges like someone had been dragging their nails over and over. Later that month, a friend came to stay. Melissa, visiting from San Diego, had never believed in ghosts. She laughed when Layla warned her the room might feel strange. That night, Melissa slept with the door open and the hallway light on. By morning, she was gone. Her suitcase was in the entryway. Her keys were on the counter. A short note was scribbled on hotel stationery. "I'm sorry. I couldn't stay another night. She doesn't like guests." She never answered Layla's calls. Mark, growing increasingly skeptical, decided to clean out the small closet at the end of the hallway. The previous owner, possibly Penny herself, had padlocked it. The key, surprisingly, was taped to the inside of the bedroom closet mirror. Inside were 6 boxes, labeled in handwriting that Mark would later match to Penny's from autographs on old movie posters. Laverne and Shirley, big, home movies, private letters, mom's things, audio logs. It was the last box that unsettled him. Old cassette tapes, each labeled only by date. The earliest from 1986. The latest, July 2018, just months before her death. Layla and Mark sat cross-legged in the bedroom, feeding tape after tape into a dusty player. They were expecting voice memos, maybe diary entries. Instead, they heard things like, "He's back again. In the mirror this time. I smell her mom's scent. Not the perfume. The other smell. It's always loudest when I try to sleep. The whispers. They keep saying the same line. Stop opening the damn door. Please don't put anyone in that room again." That night, they locked the closet and left it sealed. The last night in the house was quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No smells. No murmurs. Mark fell asleep around 10. Layla, unable to settle, wandered the hallways one last time. Something compelled her to enter the guest room. The air was still. A thin shaft of moonlight cut across the bed. She sat down, and then she heard it directly behind her, as though spoken into her ear. "I want my house back." She turned. The mirror on the wall reflected the room perfectly, except for one thing. There was a woman standing in the doorway. Stocky build, loose cardigan, a faint smirk. Layla didn't scream. She didn't move. The reflection blinked. The room did not. They moved out the next morning without discussion. They broke their lease, forfeited deposits, and left half their furniture behind. The house is currently listed as available upon request. No public tours, no photos of the guest room, and no record of the tapes. Layla burned them on the night they left. They say Penny was funny, sharp, and full of life. And she still is, especially when you try to take her house. The Pattersons' new home, for all its grandeur, began to feel like a closed film set, one waiting for a final scene that had never been shot. It was beautiful in the daytime, with dappled light pouring in through stained glass transoms, casting soft amber and green reflections across the Spanish tile. The living room, where Penny once hosted industry friends and late-night poker games, was lined with arched windows, and the fireplace carried that unmistakable scent of old soot and lavender wood polish. But as June slid into July, the beauty of the house began to feel like a trap. Layla started documenting everything in a leather journal. It began as a casual log: design ideas, paint samples, notes on tile color, but turned quickly into a kind of confessional. July 7th heard the piano again. Just one note, middle C. No power. Still unplugged. It echoed. July 11th found my makeup bag unzipped. Lipstick drawn on mirror. Not that shade. Wiped it off. Mark says I'm dreaming. July 14th guest bathroom smells like sulfur. Ran water, nothing. Drain is dry. The house responded to them, subtly at first, but unmistakably. They kept finding small items in places they hadn't left them: one of Mark's cufflinks in the freezer, a teaspoon bent backwards in the dishwasher. Their phones would occasionally ring with no number displayed, and when answered, there was only faint static or sometimes a distant laugh. Layla could never tell if it was male or female. She stopped inviting friends over, not because she feared for them, exactly, but because the house seemed to change when strangers were present. It went quiet, too quiet, like a jealous animal pretending to sleep. There was one room Penny had supposedly used as a dressing room. Located off the master suite, it was narrow and lined with full-length mirrors on both sides. Layla called it the Hall of Vanity. It was the one space she hadn't dared touch since moving in. The mirrors were heavy and original, with beveled edges and small specks of silver lost to time. Late one night, Layla wandered in. She wasn't sleepwalking, at least she didn't think so, but she had no memory of deciding to enter. The air was thick in there, hotter than the rest of the house despite the AC. As she stood between the two walls of glass, she noticed something strange. Her reflection wasn't moving right. It mimicked her posture, but not her face. Her face in the mirror was smiling faintly, coldly, while her real face was still and blank. She backed away, slowly, keeping her eyes locked on the glass. As soon as her foot crossed the threshold back into the bedroom, the smile in the reflection vanished. She didn't return to that room again. Mark chalked it up to stress, maybe a trick of the eyes. But Layla had seen something, and for the first time, she didn't try to convince him. She just said, "Please don't go in there. Ever." He didn't ask why. At the rear of the property sat a detached structure, a guest house once used as a recording studio. Penny had it built in the mid-90s, complete with soundproofed walls and vintage gear. Mark planned to convert it into a workspace for his editing projects. But the first time he entered, something felt wrong. The room was colder than the rest of the property. Not cool from shade or insulation, cold like a walk-in freezer. A musty smell of old plastic, electrical ozone, and something sweeter cloying, like gardenias left too long in a vase hung in the air. There was a reel-to-reel tape recorder still plugged in, though the outlet was long dead. Mark walked around the studio slowly, noting the untouched equipment, the neatly stacked tapes labeled in white marker, the framed photo of Penny in a director's chair, half-shadowed by dust. Then, from the overhead speaker without any device visibly running, came a sound. Not music, not dialogue. A single, dragged-out sigh. Feminine, tired, as if someone had just lowered themselves into a chair and exhaled. Mark froze. It came again, longer this time. Then silence. He backed out of the studio and locked the door behind him. He told Layla nothing. One morning, just before sunrise, Mark stood in the hallway sipping coffee. The light hadn't yet turned golden. It was a blue hush, the kind that makes everything look faded and dreamlike. He looked toward the end of the hallway, the one leading to the guest room and the sealed closet. And he saw a figure. Not moving, not menacing, just standing there. It looked like a woman. Short, wearing a bathrobe, possibly slippers. Her face was turned away, but Mark could see that her hair was pulled back in a low bun. For a moment, he genuinely thought it was Layla. Maybe sleepwalking. But when he called her name softly, Lay, the figure turned slightly. Not all the way, just enough to show the curve of one cheek, the hint of a smile. Then she stepped back and disappeared into the guest room. Mark ran toward the door and flung it open. The room was empty. Still, as always, colder than the rest of the house. He turned on every light in the hallway. He didn't tell Layla about it until 2 days later. And even then, he only said, "I saw someone. I think she used to live here." Layla said nothing, just nodded, then turned the page of her journal and wrote something down he never read. In mid-August, the Los Angeles heat pressed down like a wool blanket. The house on Crescent Drive groaned under the weight of it. The wooden eaves swelled, the garden drooped, and the once cheerful tile floors felt warm under bare feet even at night. Layla had taken to pacing the halls at odd hours, unable to sleep, her ears alert to every pop, creak, and settling sigh of the home. She had begun to treat the house like an animal observing it, learning when to approach and when to give it space. One night, while cleaning out a hallway cabinet, she found a narrow panel behind a stack of old linens. It looked like nothing, just a rectangular piece of plaster with a thumb-sized depression at the edge. But when she pressed it, a latch clicked. A panel swung open. Behind it was a tiny vestibule maybe 3 feet deep with dark red wallpaper, now peeling at the corners, and a small bulb dangling from a wire. A forgotten entrance, or possibly just a utility nook. But what caught her attention was the smell. It wasn't rot, not mildew, not even the strange perfume scent she'd grown used to. This was fresher, rich, floral, something vintage joy by Jean Patou, she thought. Her grandmother had worn it. And on the floor, set carefully like an offering, was a single photo in a brass frame. It was Penny Marshall smiling wide, drink in hand seated in what looked like the living room, a birthday cake on her lap. Beside her, in the faded image, stood an older woman in a dressing gown, barely in frame. Layla didn't recognize her, but the eyes, there was something wrong about the eyes. They weren't smiling. They weren't even looking at the camera. They were staring at Penny. She brought the photo to Mark, who glanced at it once and said, "I don't think we should move anything else from that room." Layla put the frame back the next morning. A week later, on a blisteringly hot Sunday afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was strange, no one ever visited. The front gate was always locked, and deliveries usually left things outside. Layla opened the front door cautiously and peered through the decorative glass. At the gate stood a woman in her late 60s, wearing dark sunglasses and a wide-brimmed straw hat. She held a Tupperware container in one hand and a paperback novel in the other. Her nails were perfectly manicured, and she smiled politely when she saw someone watching her. Layla stepped outside. "Hi," the woman said, her voice low and a little gravelly. "Sorry to bother you. I used to work for Ms. Marshall. I was her assistant, off and on, for about 7 years. Just found out someone new moved in." She introduced herself as Nancy Withers. Layla had never heard the name, but she nodded and opened the gate. Nancy walked slowly, as though each step on the stone pathway was being memorized. She looked around with a distant fondness. "The place looks good." She always kept it tidy, but the energy's different now. Layla didn't know what to say. Nancy handed her the Tupperware. "Lemon bars. Penny loved them. I thought I'd bring a few." She said they kept the spirits calm. Layla blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" But Nancy had already turned and was gazing up at the guest bedroom windows. She used to hear people walking around up there, Nancy said. Said it always felt like her mother was coming down the hall. Not in a scary way. Not exactly. But like she was checking in. Making sure Penny never got too big for her britches. Layla asked if she wanted to come inside, but Nancy declined. No, I don't go back in there. Not since the fire. Layla's heart slowed. What fire? Nancy tilted her head. The closet fire. In the guest room. Little one. It never made the papers. She put it out herself. But she swore afterward that it was a warning. What kind of warning? Nancy smiled again. Thinly. Not to invite strangers in. You'll see. She turned and left. When Layla looked down, the lemon bars were still cold. She threw them out without opening the lid. Later that night, she and Mark tried to search for records of a Nancy Withers. There were none. Not in Penny's biographies. Not in the staff rosters. Not even in old interviews or production credits. By September, the disturbances had grown bolder. Mark, once dismissive, had taken to sleeping with earbuds in. A white noise app playing on loop. But even those couldn't mask the sounds that now came through the HVAC system. Layla described it as the softest whisper imaginable, but it wasn't muffled. It was clear, just not loud. She first heard it while folding laundry in the master bedroom. The vent above the wardrobe clicked once, then sighed, and from it came a single sentence. You don't belong here. She froze. The words weren't angry. They were flat, matter of fact, like a line read for the 100th time. She climbed onto the dresser, unscrewed the vent, and looked inside with her phone flashlight. There was nothing there, just a dusty tunnel of metal ductwork. But she felt, with absolute certainty, that someone had just finished speaking from the other end. Later, they called a technician to inspect the system. He spent an hour crawling through the ductwork and emerged looking pale. You've got some kind of partition up there, he said. A short wall someone built inside one of the vents. It's not structural. Just sitting in place. Blocking a section. Blocking what? He shrugged. Looks like it leads to the space above the old dressing room. The one with all the mirrors? Might have been sealed for a reason. Mark nodded but said nothing. That night, they sealed the vent with duct tape. But the voice returned. This time, it came through the floorboards. By October, the air had shifted. The house, once warm with the scent of aged wood and sage, now carried a weight like wet velvet, thick, dense, clinging to the skin. The windows remained closed, even on breezy days. Mark and Layla spoke less. Their conversations had turned to short, functional exchanges. Groceries. The thermostat. A broken porch light that neither of them remembered installing. Layla no longer journaled. Her notebook remained on the bedside table, untouched for weeks, its corners curling from the heat. Every time she considered picking it up, something in the house would creak. A door would softly click shut in another room. The silence was full of intention. One night, Layla walked past the mirror room without realizing she had entered. The light was already on. Not the overhead bulb, the sconces, which hadn't worked since they'd moved in. Their soft, amber glow lit up every inch of the narrow chamber, reflecting endlessly in the facing mirrors. It looked like a tunnel of versions of herself stretching backward into forever. Only in the fourth reflection from the front, Layla was not alone. The woman beside her wasn't touching her. She wasn't even looking at her. She stood just behind her reflection, slightly turned, one hand resting against the mirrored wall. Her hair was up. Her cardigan was the same from the photo in the hidden vestibule. The woman looked tired, drained, and then she blinked. Layla turned. In real life, there was no one behind her. When she looked back into the mirror, the woman was gone, but her handprint remained. Clear, human, pressed into the glass like condensation on a car window. It slowly faded as the light flickered out. The next morning, Mark made a decision. They had never fully investigated the sealed-off portion of the house above the dressing room. The HVAC tech had mentioned a partition inside the ductwork. If something had been deliberately walled off, they had to know what it was. Layla was hesitant, but silent. Mark found the old blueprints in a manila folder behind the furnace. The plans were marked in pencil, with several amendments scrawled into the margins. One room, in particular, had been labeled and then scratched out. projection room? There was no known entrance to it. That night, Mark borrowed a power drill from the neighbor and removed the false backing of the archive closet. Behind it was a narrow passage, no more than 3 feet wide, wrapped in insulation and old movie posters. A single bulb on a string hung from the ceiling. They followed the corridor to a low door child-sized, unfinished wood, with rusted hinges. When Mark opened it, a gust of air swept past them. Not cold, but stale, staged, like the breath of something waiting for its cue. The space inside was square, silent, and painted a dull green. The walls were lined with shelving, all empty except for one corner where a dusty Super 8 projector sat facing a blank wall. Stacks of reels lay beside it, unlabeled. In the center of the room sat a single folding chair. On it a spiral-bound notepad. Layla picked it up with shaking hands. The first page was blank. The second read, "It's not done." The third, "No one finishes it right." The rest of the pages were blank. Mark took one of the unlabeled reels and threaded it into the projector. He connected an extension cord and flicked the switch. The machine sputtered, then hummed. Dust spun in the light. The image that appeared on the blank wall was grainy, black and white, filmed inside the very house they stood in. The same hallway, the same guest room. A woman, Penny Marshall, walked slowly past the camera, wearing a robe and slippers. She turned toward the lens. Her face was blank. Her lips moved. No sound. Behind her, just for a flash, a shape passed across the doorway. It was a different woman, older, hair in a bun, barefoot, dragging something behind her. A long, limp arm. The reel ended. The light stayed on. Then the bulb in the hallway blew out. Mark and Layla stared at the empty screen, unsure whether to move or wait for what would come next. They stayed one more night, not because they wanted to, but because they weren't sure how to leave. Layla woke at 3:11 a.m. to the sound of the closet door in the guest room creaking open. Mark was already awake, sitting up, listening. Neither of them moved. Then they heard it. Laughter. Dry, wheezing, like someone trying to suppress a cough and a chuckle at the same time. It came from every direction through the vents, under the bed, inside the walls. And then a whisper. I said, "Not that shade." The closet door slammed shut. That morning, they left. They packed only what they could carry. The rest they abandoned. Clothes, furniture. The lemon bars they never threw out had grown fuzzy with mold inside the sealed bin. The framed photo was missing. The mirrors in the vanity room were all shattered, each one cracked inward, as though struck from the other side. They never spoke to anyone about it. The house is back on the market. The listing doesn't mention Penny Marshall. The address is slightly altered to throw off online searches. The guest house has been torn down for renovation, though the land beneath it remains taped off. A new couple moved in 3 months ago. Young. Newlyweds. She's an actress. He's a writer. At a dinner party last week, someone asked them how they liked the place. The husband smiled and said, "It's lovely, except the lights flicker when we play old movies." The wife said nothing. She just looked down into her glass and whispered something, almost too soft to hear. It sounded like, "She's still watching." Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.